Do you think she'd be mad if she knew we were here? Oh, I'm sure she already does. Yeah, she does. Hi guys, welcome to chapter 12 of the Castor Saga. If you're new here, I have a whole playlist worth of chapters before this. Spoiler alert, this is chapter 12. Chapter 12. The Forest of Golden Rain. Each and Dawn were healed almost instantly when they entered the forest. The golden raindrops falling from the trees seemed to heal them and return any strength they had lost in the last one. They walked to the center of the forest and made camp along the tracks. Then Each and Dawn rested while the others practiced. Tony walked over to Meli to tell her about the shadowy man he saw standing in the forest of poison watching them.
Meli.
Yeah?
I saw a man following us before I stepped into this forest.
You did you?
Yeah, do you think he's the one after you?
It's very possible.
Meli, he was struck by lightning and vanished.
Meli looked at him with a skeptical expression, but she also seemed slightly worried about what he had said. Tony, are you sure you actually saw something and weren't just having hallucinations from the poison?
What poison? I wasn't poisoned, Meli.
Tony, look at your leg. Tony looked at his right leg as she pointed and saw a spiked thorn sticking into his leg. He was bleeding, and he hadn't even noticed it.
Ouch, whoa, how did I not notice that?
I guess you were focused elsewhere and got pricked. Here, I'll get it out for you. Sit down, Tony. Tony sat down, and Meli ran her hand down his leg from his knee towards his ankle, as she gently grasped onto the thorn.
Ouch, Meli.
Sorry, Tony, but it has to come out. Luke looked over and saw them and rolled his eyes. Do you need help?
I'm fine, thanks.
He is a healer, Tony.
All right, just gentle, please.
Of course. Luke gently tapped the thorn with his finger, and then slowly raised his hands as the thorn shook and began to slowly rise out of Tony's leg. Ah, God, this is not fun. Wanna just do it like a Band-Aid?
Yeah, man, just get it over with.
All right, Tony. 1. Luke yanked the fingernail-sized thorn out, throwing it through the air at a tree before he even said 2. Tony yelled loudly and looked at Luke with an irritated and annoyed look. Then Luke smiled and shrugged. 2, 3. Meli laughed and slapped herself on the forehead, shaking her head and smiling at both of them. Okay, Tony. Thank you, Luke. Tony watched as a drop of golden rain fell from above them directly into his wound and healed it in a matter of seconds.
Oh, my God.
That was the worst feeling, Meli. I know, hun. I know. Luke walked away, then Meli turned as Tony stood up.
Meli, what about the person after you? Even if I didn't see what I thought I saw, someone's still after you.
Meli put a finger against Tony's lips and shook her head. Shh, Tony. We're safe here. Let's just relax while we can, okay? Meli turned and walked away from him as everyone else set up their stuff. Meli turned to everyone with a smile and shouted so they'd all hear her. Here we can go off the tracks. I'm gonna go for a little walk. If I'm not back soon, assume I'm dead and just move on. Everyone looked confused when she said that. Then Rose spoke as if to get something else out of her. You're kidding, right? Yeah, I'm kidding. This place is completely safe. It's just a short walk. Should be, no more than 30 minutes. All right, well, come back soon, okay? Like, before it gets dark, maybe? I will. Meli turned and began to walk away, but Tony grabbed her arm, stopping her.
Meli, where are you going?
I'm just going for a walk, Tony. Just clearing my head,
I don't like you wandering off by yourself.
I'm fine, Tony. Let me go. I'll be right back. Tony looked Meli in the eye and saw almost a sorrowful expression in her face. He let go of her arm and stepped back, then smiled sarcastically.
All right, fine. You want to go? Go. Not like it's my fault if you get hurt.
Meli shook her head, looking at him with an annoyed look. Her eyes were almost mournful as she stepped away and jumped the tracks, walking down through the trees. She turned and looked back at Tony for a moment, then turned and walked away. Keith and Each walked up with Luke behind Tony, and Keith whacked him in the back of the head.
Hey! Ouch!
Dick move, man. Dick move.
What? She wanted to go.
You really don't get it, do you?
Get what?
She wanted you to ask if you could go with her, not tell her she couldn't go. Oh, and I'm supposed to know that? We all did. Well, I guess I'm not as much like you as you thought.
Dude, shut up. We're all just as stressed as you are. You guys didn't see what I saw. I saw the person after Meli. He's following us. He? Yes, he. Either that or a super buff, disproportional woman. He was struck by lightning and disappeared. Well then, let's just follow her. You know, make sure she's okay. Who knows, maybe she's gonna go and try and lead him away from us. Yeah, but how can we follow her? She'll know we're there. Not if we stay in the trees, maybe. Come on, guys, let's go. Eej, are you okay to go? Yeah, I'm fine now, let's go. Great, come on, guys. Luke, Eej, and Keith jumped the tracks and up into the trees, then looked down at Tony. You coming or what? Tony stood there a moment, then took a deep breath and jumped the tracks, following them up. The trees were old ponderosa pine trees, and they swayed as the dead needles fell from above, and the green needles scratched along their skin gently. Below them they saw an abundance of sagebrush and drier bitterbrush. It looked a lot like the first forest, but without the angelic spirits floating around everywhere. In fact, they didn't see a single creature here, with the exception of a few regular animals, like deer or squirrels. They followed Meli's footprints in the dust below until they found her in an open field of tall, flowing yellow grass. She was walking around, and she had come out to what appeared to be an old dirt road that no one had really driven on in years. The only trace of anyone being on the road was her footprints. Tony and the boys stayed hunkered back at the base of a huge pine tree. They crawled over to the edge of the trees and stayed down behind a log as they watched Meli. She pulled out what appeared to be a brown journal that she'd been given by the spirits in the first forest. She looked all around her, then opened the book, and began singing a little tune from her book. Nehame samoshianu leaoki nekom Tealema moshinanu lerehane amosu. She held the book out in front of her. Then as she stepped back, the book began floating. She walked around the floating book singing in a strange and unfamiliar dialect. It were as if she were singing to the book. Suddenly the pages in the journal began flying out and floating around as if in a tornado. The pages came down and formed in the shape of a human body, with the book as the body's heart and chest. Meli stood in front of the paper body and started singing to it again. It tilted its head to the right, as if it were alive. Tony and the boys watched from a distance as all of this happened. They were in shock. Whoa. I can't do that. This doesn't make sense. She's a nature caster, even being a storm caster. How in the hell is she doing that? She is a crossover caster. Maybe it's something to do with what she was saying before. I don't know, but whatever she is, this is not your average magic. She just created life from paper. Tony spoke up. He knew exactly what she was doing. I know how she did it. How? How, Tony? Paper comes from trees. Trees are nature. She simply brought the tree back to life in another form. Even an advanced healer can't reanimate something that has been processed by a machine. Well, she did. So she must be more than an advanced healer. She must be something even more special. She breathed life back into something that anyone else would have considered dead. Most people would have never considered it alive in the first place. She's amazing. Yeah, you said it. Tony? Tony was in a complete trance, as if he were a predator staring at a wounded fawn. The only difference was that Melissa was no fawn. She was a wolf, and according to her, Tony was a panther. They were a typical game of cat and mouse, except the mouse was a wolf, and the wolf could eat the cat if it wanted to, but instead it just bared its fangs, then smiled and asked the cat to join it in howling at the moon. Tony knew that Meli was dangerous, and yet he wasn't afraid anymore. Everything different that he'd been afraid of his entire life, everything he ever doubted to be possible, was laid out in front of him, and he wasn't scared of it at all. Tony looked down at Luke as he kneeled beside him. Tony! Huh? Do you think she'd be mad if she knew we were here? Oh, I'm sure she already does. Tony looked out at Meli with a soft smile and kind eyes. He saw her glance their direction, as she finished singing the little melody she was singing. He smiled and nodded his head back, acknowledging her look. She smiled at him, and then went back to speaking to her paper person. Eventually, though, it began to get dark, and they all knew they should be getting back to the others. Meli bowed to her paper person, who began falling apart as the pages folded themselves neatly and reattached to the journal,
that remained floating until Meli plucked it from in front of her. Then she put it gently back into her bag. She then walked over to the boys and smiled. "Come on, boys. Time to head back." "That was amazing, Meli." "It really was. How'd you do that?" "It's just a matter of manipulation magic. Well, that, and a magic journal, of course." They kind of laughed. Then Meli walked up to Tony. "Tony." "I'm sorry, Melissa. I shouldn't have doubted you. I'm not sure really what's happening to me. I'm just acting weird, I guess." "Well, duh, Tony. That's kind of obvious, isn't it?" "You know why, though, right?" No. Why?" "You and Meli are a natural fit as partners. Basically, you're just as crazy as her, and therefore, being her casting partner just makes you obsessive because, well, one of you has to be. When Allie was still with us, she was the obsessive one in our pairing." "Why does one of us have to be obsessive?" "To make sure that when you're casting, neither of you screws up." "And why is that my job? Just random, by default? What?" "You're a shadow caster, Tony. That's why. It's why shadow nature pairings work so well. She's the dreamer, and you're the realist. You keep her grounded, and she gets you up out of your head." I guess that could be helpful. But that was a horrible feeling, so... Basically, you can't stop her from doing anything, but you just kind of make sure she hears a second opinion. Tony looked at Meli with a smirk and kind of chuckled. "So essentially, I'm her babysitter." "Precisely." Meli looked at them annoyed as they laughed, crossing her arms, then said her next statement with pauses after each word, emphasizing her point. "Hey, I do not need a babysitter." "Well, apparently you do, and guess what? You're stuck with me, sweetie." Yeah. The boys all laughed, and Meli smiled as they walked back to camp and sat with the others around the fire. Luke, Eej, and Keith didn't say anything about what Meli had done. They'd just decided to keep it to themselves, and Tony agreed. No one needed to know if they hadn't seen it themselves. And honestly, they didn't even really know why she had done it. Tony and Meli sat in front of a log beside the fire, and Tony put his arm up behind her back as she laid her head back against his arm. "Tired, Meli?" "Yeah, I'm just resting my eyes, though." "Hey, so what's the next forest we'll be going through, Meli?" "Oh, it's the Forest of Trails. We have to decide which path to take, and there's no way of knowing which path is correct. It's kind of like a maze." "So it's a total blind guess?" "Yeah, basically." "Oh, fun." "Yeah, get some rest, everyone. You'll need your nerves rested." They all laid down to sleep, except for Meli and Tony. They sat up to talk a little longer. "So, Meli, do you understand this whole casting partners thing?" "Yeah, for the most part. I've looked into it. Supposedly, each caster has 3 different kinds of main bonds, and then several half bonds. A casting partner bond, which is what we have, a sibling bond, to brothers or sisters, and then a couple's bond for when they choose a spouse, are the 3 main ones. And from what I understand, a single person can only have a single casting partner bond, whereas the others can be multiple." "That makes sense. I guess that's why one partner ends up being kind of obsessive at first. It's a one-and-done kind of deal, and if you don't choose wisely, you're out of luck." "Yeah, well, sorry if I ended up different from what you'd prefer, or from what you'd expected." "You kidding?" Tony pulled her in close, using his arm behind her to pull her over towards him. Then he kissed her on the forehead and smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Meli." She smiled up at him and tilted her head to the side. "Me either. Partner." He chuckled and smiled down at her kindly. "Meli, what's the challenge of this forest supposed to be? Is it just a freebie? 'Cause that seems way too easy to me." Meli smiled sheepishly and bowed her head a moment, then glancing up at him. She scratched her head, then looked at him with a sigh. "You couldn't just let one go, could you?" He chuckled and responded. "Sorry, I'm curious." "Fair enough." Meli paused a moment, but finally started telling him what she knew. Supposedly, I don't believe it's true, but the story goes that there's a kind of creature in this forest that supposedly lives here, and it's the only type of creature that lives in the forest that's capable of moving between different forest and gated areas, as well as outside the train tracks. Whoa, really? Yeah. Supposedly, this type of creature will follow the train from the very beginning of the tracks in Benedict, all the way to the Garden of Lily, and it only preys on specific kinds of castors. It plays with your mind and tricks you into believing all sorts of things that normally you wouldn't believe. When you get to this forest that it supposedly calls home, it'll try and lure you and others off the tracks. They can throw their voices and mimic human voices. Then, if they get you where they want you, they mark you as their chosen victims. If you fall for it and give in to it, it's said that the worst possible thing will happen to you, regardless of if you make it out of the forest alive or not. If you get to the final forest, and it's marked you, supposedly, it'll try and kill you there, as a sort of twisted game it plays. Tony remembered the things that had been written on the note left to Meli on the tracks when they found Ben and Sam. Kill or be killed. You call it a game. We cannot allow you to live with your shame. Either do your job and let them leave, or these last few castors will do nothing but bleed. He didn't know what that meant, but remembering it began to make him nervous about the things Meli was saying. Oh yeah? I guess people have reported seeing these kinds of creatures, but no one can ever get a good enough glimpse of them to describe them without getting killed. That's the story, at least. I don't really believe it, though. I mean, we would have noticed by now if something really scary was actually following us. What about the dark male figure I saw that disappeared in the forest of poison? What if that's one of these unknown creatures, and you're one of the kinds of castors they prey on? Oh, I doubt that. No, Meli, think about it. You're a special kind of castor. What if it's waiting to take you out until the end? Tony, I think you're a lot more worried about it than I am. Of course I'm worried, Meli. I care about you a lot. I can't just let it kill you. You're my partner. Meli was quiet for a moment, then leaned over beside Tony, seeming upset by the topic. Her entire character changed in that instance. She went from being kind of cocky and trying to play with him and mess with him and kind of scare him on purpose almost, to now suddenly she was scared herself. Something about that didn't sit right with him. But he disregarded it, because he didn't want to scare her any more than she already seemed to be. Tony, please, can we talk about something else? I don't like telling scary stories in the dark. It's honestly beginning to scare me. Sure, yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't think anything about it. Of course we can. We can talk about something else. He was suspicious of the fact that she wanted to change the subject the second he connected the story to something potentially hurting her, but he didn't want to upset her, so he let it go. They were both quiet for a moment, and he pulled her close and squeezed her gently. Hey, it's okay. Why don't you tell me your next wisdom life rule thing that you have to tell me? You haven't told me one in a while. What number are we on now? 13? Meli smiled and nodded, and nuzzled into him, laying her head against his chest as she looked up at the starry sky above them. Yeah. It's what I learned from my cousin growing up. Rule number 13. It is important to know the difference between peaceful and harmless. To be peaceful, you must be capable of great violence and choose peace instead. If you're not capable of violence, you're harmless, not peaceful. It's an important distinction between the two. In my family, we consider ourselves peaceful. You do the math. Your cousin sounds wise. That's a good rule to remember. Yeah, I think it's probably one of my favorites. Mine too. Tony realized Meli wasn't feeling very peppy after their conversation, and he didn't want her to overthink it. He turned her to face him more and pulled her close, letting her rest against his chest a little more. Try and rest, Meli. I've got you. You too. Tony nodded and turned so they were facing each other before they slowly closed their eyes and went off to sleep. He held her close that night, feeling guilty for making her feel afraid of whatever was rumored to be out there. What he didn't know was that she wasn't afraid of it. Not in the slightest. She could beat it if she wanted to, but she'd never have to. Because the creature she spoke of would never come after Meli. It didn't have the strength nor the ability to hurt her. She knew this, but she wanted to lay with Tony close anyway. He was warm and smelled good and brought her peace as she slept. He was a good friend, and she knew that too. The next morning, they all woke up to a bright and sunny day. Not a cloud in the blue sky as the sun rose and warmed them up quickly. They were so comfy and warm that they really didn't want to move, but eventually they all slowly got up. Meli woke up and rolled over onto her back, then turned her head glancing at Tony. He had a relaxed smile on his face as he laid there asleep. He was beautiful, really. His jet black hair and curtain-style bangs falling gently just above his eyes. His pale freckled skin in the sun that was similar to her own. His deep breathing that showed Meli that he was still asleep. And yet there was something different about him this morning. Meli reached over and pushed Tony's shoulder as he rolled over onto his back. He covered his eyes with his arm, but he smiled like a child. "Tony, wake up." "Who said I was asleep, Mels?" "Well, time to get up. It's time to go. We're almost there." "Yeah, so what's the rush?" He laughed and she stood up looking down at him with her hands on her hips. "Tony." I'm up." Tony rolled up sitting, then rubbed his eyes and stood up lifting himself with one hand onto his feet. He looked down at Meli, and she hugged him, smiling. "Thank you. Now come on. I have a new idea for a casting that I want to see if you can do. Let's practice before the others get ready to go." "Okay. What is it?" "I want to see you bring forth your panther spirit." "Oh, really? You think I can?" "Yeah. Except this time, I want you to do it on purpose." Meli began to walk away, and he followed her away from the others. Everyone has an animal spirit, and I feel like a lot of your power is being held back because you've yet to unleash your animal spirit completely. Well, whatever you say, Meli. They walked down the tracks while the others cleaned up their camp and stood facing each other. "So, how exactly does this work?" "Well, first, you gotta get your glow on." Tony laughed and Meli flashed her eyes white. He smiled and copied her, lighting his up purple. "Good. Now, close your eyes and picture your spirit." Tony did as she said, and listened as she spoke to him. "Okay, now try to imagine that all the energy inside of your body is building up inside your heart. Imagine it circling your heart, and then suddenly flowing to your fingertips all at once. And as it does," Tony opened his eyes slowly and saw that his entire body had a purple glow encasing it. "Focus it, Tony." Tony focused hard, and he suddenly felt the rush of energy erupt from within him as a purple panther leapt from his body, then turned around and stared at him. It was ghostly looking, purple, and looked like pure energy. You could see through it, and yet nothing in the world looked more real to him. Tony was slightly confused by what he saw. "Don't be scared, Tony. Embrace it." The purple flame-like panther stepped towards Tony, and then bowed its head to him. He smiled. Then the panther pounced at him and dove straight back into his soul. Meli walked over to Tony and stood there as he looked at his hands. "How do you feel?" She dimmed her eyes to normal as his remained glowing purple. Not sure. It's different, for sure." Meli smiled and put a hand on his shoulder. "Tony?" He looked at her, and his eyes dimmed out as he smiled kindly at her. I think I did it." "You did, Tony." Jake walked over behind them and kind of snuck up on them. Tony hadn't heard him walk over, and it startled him slightly. "Hey, guys!" Tony turned quickly, and his eyes flashed as a growl came from inside of him. Whoa, was that me?" "Yes, it was."
"Cool."
Meli laughed as Jake came over. "Need something?" We're thinking it's time to go, guys." "Alright, let's get moving then." They walked towards the forest of trails, but as they approached it, everyone started getting a feeling like they were being watched. Meli looked all around them, without turning her head an inch. Her eyes dashed all around, but nobody really seemed to notice. Chrissy and Dawn were really scared, and they felt like something was going to come out and attack them at any moment. But Meli seemed very calm, so they tried to stay close to her. "You hear that?" "I did. What was that?" "Keep moving, girls. Just ignore them." "Them? What are they?" "Shh. Just keep moving." They kept their heads down, following Meli down the tracks, and eventually they made it to the forest of trails. They were all a little nervous, but not about what they'd see. They were more worried about what was following them. But Meli obviously wasn't. And that concludes Chapter 12. Thank you very much for listening. If you haven't already, subscribe below. And until next time, I love you guys very much. Bye.